from a blackmail perspective, this doesn't get reported in the public domain very frequently. That could be that individuals want to keep it quiet. It could be that companies want to keep it quiet, so it doesn't get out there.
Sorry to be so draconian. You shouldn't be posting anything about your work on your own private sites. If a company can have a genuine open disclosure policy to limit the embarrassment on that individual, ideally that has to be confidential as well.
So welcome to the BCP podcast. You may notice that I am not Matthew Wardner. I'm a guest host for today. My name is Kim McAllister, and I'm really, really pleased to be joined by David Payne and John Cooper. We have a military background and a police background, which I think are going to be really interesting for the topic we're going to discuss today, which is blackmail, the risk of blackmail to your company. And the reason we're chatting about it today is because there's been stories in the news about a certain member of Parliament being the victim of blackmail and how he dealt with it. We are not a political podcast. We're not going to go into the ins and outs, but I do think it's a great opportunity to chat about it. So David and John, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning, both, and thank you for having me.
Good morning, both. Thanks for inviting me.
So this is a really interesting topic, the risk of blackmail. Do you think it's something that people understand fully? How big a risk actually is it?
I think it's actually far bigger than we appreciate. From a resilience and a business continuity planning background, which is obviously where we come from, and a response background, we deal with a lot of threats, and we plan for things like the crashes, the oil spills. We do a lot with oil spill response and things. I think that from a blackmail perspective, this doesn't get reported in the public domain very, very frequently. And I think by the very nature of it, it's the things that people want to keep quiet. That could be that individuals want to keep it quiet. It could be that companies want to keep it quiet. So it doesn't get out there. So yes, I think it's a far bigger problem. And actually, if you look at the impact of it, we look at issues that are high impact and potentially, hopefully, low likelihood. I think this blackmail issue, especially when you wrap it up, I know we're not going to talk about cyber as much, but I think that from a cyber perspective, when you do include that, the likelihood is actually higher, and the impact can go from potentially low to medium impact all the way up to very high impact. So it's something we should be alive to.
Yeah.
I'm sure that John's got a view on it.
Yeah, John, your background is in policing, and I'm sure blackmail was something that police dealt with a lot. What's been your experience of the risks of blackmail?
Yeah, we did deal with it. I think that one of the biggest issues that David did actually touch on there was that what goes unreported. And again, I think for us, it's not the massive, well-planned out, sort of high-profile political that you were talking about in the news recently. I think it can be something quite innocuous that if you have a problem with a company, or we keep talking about the insider threat, if you're not happy or you're aggrieved, it could be something as simple as trying to get an explicit picture of somebody, or even following some of the work colleagues to a bar where they're, off duty, they're having a drink, they're unloading or offloading to each other, and you overhear comments they make about a particular, director or senior manager, and you've almost got a little bit of a hook in there. You can either go to that person and say, look, we've recorded you saying this about your boss or a senior manager. It just starts with this very small hook, and that can then build. So my worry would be that what goes unreported, that's probably the real concern, I think.
I think a story like that's only likely to break, isn't it, when it becomes a big story? So who knows what's happened in the background before the big story has broken?
So it's a much bigger threat than probably most companies would imagine. How do you start that conversation then when you've been brought in to talk about business resilience? How do you approach the issue of blackmail?
Kim, you're absolutely right. I think the problem is that with all the technology that we have these days, depending on that person, and again, I don't want to harp on about an insider threat. Could have been that a device is given to a cleaner or somebody who comes in the early hours to leave in an office, perhaps in a boardroom. If somebody knows that a company is going to be talking about redundancies, for example, there'll be people within that company that would like to know. And some pretty senior people from the senior executive team would be there with their HR directors or people to make these difficult decisions. And if you can record that or in some way get that information, which is quite simple to do with bugging devices or electronic devices that can be placed. You touched on it. It all starts with a very innocuous incident. If you're actually targeted, I think that's going into another role. It's a very difficult one to get out of. People are targeting you, like a state targeting, whether it be Chinese or Iranian or Russian. That's at the very, very top level. But at the bottom level, certainly for us, it's just making sure that you've got all your social media policies are in place. The way I live my life, I'm quite nervous of social media. I see the damage that it can do, and I'm not particularly confident with it. But our advice to certain companies would be that, and it's difficult depending on what industry you're in, because some people crave the TikToking and, posting these messages about, even in a financial firm, they'll say, look, congratulations today on so-and-so who's 20 years into the business, or we raised all that money for the cancer research. It sounds innocuous, but for me, I'd rather they weren't posting at all during work, and that there was a policy, again, sorry to be so draconian, that you shouldn't be posting anything about your work on your own private sites. And I'll give you an example of that, where we had a young girl, they came to us, they were talking about redundancies, and she was one of the people that was potentially going to be made redundant, and posted something on one of her sites, whether it was Facebook or Instagram or I don't know. And that then got back to the company, and she was immediately sacked. Now, she was one of the people that was potentially going to be, but when I say she posted something about the company that was not favorable and having a go at the company, how much money they'd made and why are they doing this sort of thing. That's just in your private life. So certainly some of the companies we work with, we would encourage people or them to have a policy. At the very top end, it's a strap environment where you're not even allowed electronic devices, phones, watches into an office space, or certainly not posting during work hours, or not posting anything about the company. But again, there's obviously a rub there, because some of these companies want to advertise and they crave the attention. So I do understand that there's a rub there. It's just being very mindful that I think it is a lot easier than people do appreciate to get to somebody and get that hook in that David referred to earlier on.
I think it's it's twofold, isn't it? There's the good old risk bow tie that we talk about, the actual event being the center point of the bow tie. And then on the left-hand side is what action can you take before the event to either reduce the likelihood or to reduce the impact of it. And then there's actually the right-hand side of it, which is what do you do if you have been hit by one of these. And clearly we operate on both the left and the right-hand side. John is really talking then about trying to reduce the risk of something happening by education. And I think that's great. I think that if we can do more of a staff education process so that they are aware of the dangers and the risks of social media. And my kids are probably far more aware of these things than I am. And undoubtedly, they're on all these social sites. I'm not, for exactly the reasons that John has said. But I do realize that actually for many businesses, it's an essential part of marketing, and it's an essential part of getting the word out about what their brand is. What are we doing now? We're doing a podcast. We are sort of doing this right now. So we're sort of doing it ourselves. But so I think that there's very much a cultural side of things. And we talked about this hook that if you are a company, somebody might come to you, a Blackmailer might come to a staff member, and they might get something small on you. They might say, do this, give me something, give me a little bit of information. It's not going to be very much. And it gradually grows and grows and grows. And I think that certainly my understanding and my reading around this subject is that they're not going to come in at you with this massive, great blackmail for hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds right from the word go. It's probably going to build.
Yeah.
And if you can get one of your staff members who gets caught, they keep their head down initially, they just comply, they give them what they want, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And you're going to reach a tipping point when the opportunity almost for them to own up and for them to fess up to the company and say, look, go take a senior manager or a line manager to one side and say, I'm being blackmailed here. I've been asked to do this. They're going to do so much, and they'll reach a point where they can no longer do that because the consequences are now so big that they just can't.
Yeah.
And then the story's going to break, and potentially, is that what happened to William Ragg? I don't know. I'm not going to get into all that. How they deal with it and how a company deals with it is entirely up to them. But I think that, if we can change the culture in a company and people can be aware of it so that people will own up and highlight these issues earlier, the impact can be dealt with more easily.
And it depends on the industry as well. You were saying you've obviously got a military background, David, and so you were interviewed And that sort of left side of the bow tie was really intense for you. Some of the questions they ask you are quite intrusive, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. I mean, and I think to a certain extent, I would say necessarily so, because the way that the military, certainly when I was in, and it was a number of years ago, you go through different levels of security clearance, and the higher up you go, the more they want to know. And the idea is supposedly to try and stop you from being blackmailed. If they're already aware of something, you can't be blackmailed for it. So they want you to be honest, and they talk to you about what did you do, and what is your financial history, your sexual history, etc., etc. They want to sort of talk about it, and it is quite intrusive, but it's all in private and it's all in confidence. But if somebody does come up to them later on and say, I'm aware that ... they said, yeah, we already know. It's all right. It's not a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. It might still be a reputational issue if it hits the media that they would have to deal with, but it may not be giving away national secrets.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It is very much dependent on the industry that you're in.
Yeah.
But we all know that the value of the client information, any client data that we store, if that gets out, the reputational damage could sink a company.
Yeah, yeah.
Certainly a small company.
Yeah.
That is struggling. Yeah, it could have massive, massive implications for them.
And John, you were saying, with your police background, we're talking about the sort of spectrum, I guess, and you were protecting royalty. You were, making sure that political figures were secure and safe, and the things that you had to guard against so that blackmailers couldn't get their hands on it are things that people like me would never even think of. What were in your head when you were protecting these individuals?
Yeah, Kim, certainly from our perspective, it was right across the spectrum. It could be something as innocuous or embarrassing as getting an inappropriate photograph of somebody getting out of a vehicle or coming down the steps of a plane. If it's windy and they get a photograph of a skirt lifting up or something like that. That could be, innocuous photograph that's an opportunity that, the press would be there with their lenses. And as you'll know, some of these lenses can be incredibly powerful and they can be a long way off. And then there's right the way down to sort of almost the planned embarrassment factor where they could either get photographs inside a hotel or inside a bathroom or, a private area where that person doesn't know. So we'd have to be very mindful of that. I think David touched on an important point, is education. I think a lot of the younger people joining firms, they've come through most of their school life and university life, if they've gone down that path, using social media. And, what worries me about social media is that if somebody takes a photograph of you and they post that photograph of you and another person, you have no control over that. You can't bring that down. You can't recover it. It's out there. There was that classic example of the guy that took 4 days off work sick, and actually he'd gone with the Barney Army, and the next thing he's on the BBC being filmed jumping up and down because so-and-so's got his 100 in Barbados. Try explaining that to your boss.
Yeah.
And what actually sunk him was that somebody had taken a picture of them there that he wasn't even aware of. He was in the picture in the background and posted it, and someone had gone, that's John Cooper. He's off sick.
Yeah.
So, and again, that was an accident, probably a silly accident on his behalf, but something as simple as making sure you've got your privacy settings on, whether it's Strava, whether it's, being careful with what you post on LinkedIn. But I think that's important, the education side of things. But the worry for me is that things can be posted. And I'll give you an example that, 3 people had gone away after university. They had a summer break. 2 of them were medics and one of them was doing law. And they were on holiday, and there were 3 girls, 19 years old, and 2 of them had been topless on the beach, and there was a photograph. Now, no one ever expected that photograph to go anywhere. And in the olden days, when David and I were young,
long time ago,
the big decision was 24 or 36 pictures you take, and you came scurrying back from your holiday, and if you did take 24, there were probably 22 of them were useless, and one of them was fuzzy, and the other one actually was a picture, but it probably wasn't a very good one. With digital now, it's very, very easy to get photographs. But in that instance, one of those pictures went back to the university, and that person never expected or intended for that photograph to be used in that. It was a holiday, enjoying themselves, relaxed. But again, that's an innocuous way that things can come back. And I think the education, to certainly the younger people, is very, very important. So if you then put that into sinister where somebody's being targeted in an organization, it's much easier than people realize to get an explicit photograph or some audio that you're saying something that, was a private conversation between you and I about somebody else. And that's where the hook comes. I would suggest that firms have a genuine policy that you can self-declare. Now, certainly in the police, we had that, but, you'd have to be very careful because would your career be over or would that be your promotion prospects gone? So if you're going to have something like that, it needs to be genuine.
Yeah.
Because if people are suspicious of it, they won't use it. But certainly I would feel comfortable at Inveroy going to my bosses and speaking to them and say, look, I'm very, very sorry. This is what's happened. I had no intention of embarrassing myself, certainly you or the company. So we're very fortunate that we have that open policy, but a lot of companies might not. But it has to be a policy that's genuine, and it's not going to be something that afterwards are going to be reprisals against me.
I think that's a really, really valid point, because we talked about the culture earlier on, and I was sort of looking at it from the staff perspective, but actually it's really important that that same culture exists at the senior level. Exactly, say through the senior staff putting a policy in place and then enacting it, so that they're not necessarily going to hang, draw and quarter somebody who owns up, because you're right, they won't do it. There's got to be repercussions. You can't just fess up and get away with it, but as long as it's realistic.
So if the absolute worst does happen, and it kind of makes me shiver to even think about it, given how our conversation has gone, what should an individual do and what should a company do?
I think that from an individual perspective, clearly we would advise people to own up. And obviously we work with companies, we advise on emergency response, crisis management, and then the business continuity side of things. And generally the way that we would approach this and the way we write plans is such that we have a plan to deal with any incident, not a plan for every incident. And I think that this blackmail can actually be brought into that emergency response plan. I think that from a corporate perspective, I think that you would respond in the same way that you would do to another incident, which would be to form your team and get your incident management team together, but make sure you get the right people in the right place at the right time. If we were dealing with an incident that is more operationally focused, let's say, for example, a crash or an oil spill, then we might have lots of operational people in the room. But for this, a blackmail type incident, once we're aware of it, then we probably need lots of HR in the room. I would imagine we need legal, potentially need finance, depending on the thoughts about whether is it financial blackmail, and we clearly need communications in the room because there's the potential for the reputational damage. And I think that once you've got the right people initially, and you can bring more people in, you can bring different people in to tailor it as required. The decision on whether you tell the police is yours, is the company's. We would clearly recommend that the police are involved earlier on, and you notify the right people and you bring in the experts. But I'm aware that on certain occasions, some people say, I don't actually want this to get to the police. Why they would do that is entirely their own.
Yep.
But you've got the right people talking about it. And my initial thought would be to understand the threat. Is it a credible threat? Or is it just somebody who's just trying it on? Is it a low-level threat? Is it and what is the nature of that? Where's the threat coming from? Is it an individual? Because there is the potential for it to be a disgruntled staff member. Somebody may have been laid off. We could have had redundancies. We could have had just somebody who's had a disciplinary issue, who suddenly now has got a bit of an axe to grind, and they're acting on their own. And I think that the way the response to that is different to if it's the response to a threat from a larger organization, a bit more established, as maybe dare we say, state-sponsored or a larger sort of cyber group or something. So I think that your response there would differ. So you need to understand who has done that. Then once you've done that, you try and understand, I think, why are they doing it? If it's a disgruntled staff member, it's potentially easier to deal with than a larger one. You might be able to placate them a little bit more easily, or at least gain an understanding of what it is. Clearly, you then got to work out what the worst case scenario is. Where could this go? Is the impact of this potentially reasonably low? Could we deal with it and say, okay, we're actually happy. You can blackmail us. Go on, do your worst. You release that photograph. We're now ready for it. We're planned, and the impact of that isn't quite as bad as it might seem. Or is it catastrophic? Is there likely to be personal injury? If there is, obviously we've got to take that response a lot more seriously. And then you carry on and you respond accordingly. You try to get your plans there. You get your communications team in to try and get an advance of this And Kim, with your communications background, you'll be all over this. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts from a communication side of things on how you would deal with it. But I think that to be able to talk about stakeholders, think about stakeholders, who else is likely to be impacted, how do we communicate with them, who's going to communicate with them, what are they saying, make sure we're all saying the same things. If the story does break, do we break it ourselves? That's another one. Do we actually fess up early on and say we are being blackmailed and we get in there before somebody else does? That could be an option.
I imagine that would be very comforting if it was an individual, it was the worst thing they could possibly think of, that someone has a compromising photograph or someone has information, particularly if your family is at risk as well, to have a company go, this is very unpleasant, but we have a plan, we have a team, we know what to do. That would be very comforting, I imagine, and quite a successful way forward. From a communications point of view, I have sort of observed these stories as they break, and I just put my head in my hands sometimes, because the amount of companies who just want to deny, or push it away, and then it comes out and it's much bigger than it ever should have been, really, because they haven't got out in front of it. They haven't just been human about it and said, look, we hold our hands up, this has happened, make the relevant apologies, make the relevant explanations, and then also kind of be sensible and kind of professional about it. There's a point at which we're not going to comment on this because it's personal or because of the nature of the particular issue. And people respect that. But I think when there's mystery and denials and things, that just feeds the story, doesn't it? What's been your experience, John?
Yeah, it does.
No, I totally agree. Probably the biggest case I would suggest in the last few weeks is the photograph of Kate. It just seemed like such an own goal. And what surprised me about that is they have access to what you would suggest and only hope to be some of the best media strategy people in the world, media comms, whatever it is. They must be right up there with the best. And somehow they made this faux pas mistake, or maybe they did it deliberately, I don't know. But it came out, and as you say, it became a much bigger story, and then it went the full circle to where they got to. It just seems strange that something like that happened. Going back to David's point, for me, that there could be accidental photographic imagery gets out, if it's malicious, if it's somebody, as you say, in the company that isn't happy, they're potentially being made redundant. From an oil and gas point of view, without naming any names, one of the things they're really concerned about is the environment. And certainly the companies we work with, it's really important that they have statements almost ready to go on any spillage or any leakage. And it's not a denial. It's an out there going, look, this is what's happened. It might have been a 55-gallon drum of diesel that fell off a lorry. But if that happens in Alaska, at minus 15 degrees, and someone's got imagery of this going onto the snow or into the ice, that's not the time to deny it and try and shut everything down. You can actually turn that into not a good news story, but this is what's happened. It was an accident, or this is how it happened, and this is what we've done to rectify it. And actually, we've taken 1,000 tons of ice, cleaned it, and when it's gone back, it's been cleaner than it was before we picked it up, kind of idea.
Yeah.
But have those, from a comms point of view, it's very, very important to have certain messaging almost ready to go.
Yeah, definitely. We would certainly advise all our comms teams to have that pre-planned, almost insert the blanks, so they can get something out there, fill that media void early, even if it's just a holding statement.
A holding statement. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Press release later on.
It's a very simple tool, a holding statement. We're aware, we're dealing with it. Please bear with us. We'll let you know as soon as we can. That people respond well to that. It's the silence and the no comment that just creates the hunger, doesn't it, for the big story. So.
But I think then the other communications piece is not just with the media, it's that stakeholders. Yeah. It's who else is likely to be impacted. Because, if we were a partner with a company and something that company did, we heard about that was got reputational damage and we heard about it via the media, then there's going to be a little bit of either egg on face and we're going to be disappointed. So it's who else do we need to tell in advance of this story breaking on the media so that they can get their own comms piece out. So it's about working together as a team, I think.
Yeah.
We were talking initially about that left of the bow tie. What can we do in advance? And I think that one of the things we've talked about as well, that training. I think another piece we can mention is also the indicators and warnings of something happening. So it's trying to keep the eye on the staff, if you like, and are people acting differently? What might be happening? What might lead on to this kind of issue? What might create it? Because I would imagine that a lot of these issues are probably smaller ones that we could deal with reasonably straightforward.
The one issue that we've not really touched on, which I think is a very big issue when we're talking about blackmail, ego. How can you legislate
Ego.
for ego?
I don't think you can. I think you just have to accept the fact that ego exists. It's just something that it will always be there. Some people will want and they might relish the idea of some of these photographs being out there. You look at some of the stars, you look at some of the photographs that have almost been endorsed by them. But then there are other people then who are very protectionist. Short of the cultural and the educational side of things that we've talked about, I don't think there is much that you can do about it, really.
I think you can use a bit of common sense. I think it's very important that a lot of the companies out there, so depending on the industry, if you're doing anything that could rub up against environmental activists, for example, let's just use an oil and gas company in this instance. And if the people who are trying to target these companies, it used to be that they try and slow the traffic down in London. And what they're looking for is they're looking for footage, they're looking for, getting their message across and getting as much media publicity as possible. In some ways, it's safer for them to say, right, okay, that's the company that we don't like because they've got a new licensing agreement drilling in that place that we were told they would never be allowed to drill. So rather than going after them, find out who the senior executive leadership team are. It's all a company house. It's normally very easy to find this sort of information. And then they've got a name. And before you do it, you can tie back into whether it be LinkedIn, these social media sites, or Google to identify who that person is and then target them. And I don't just mean target them at their, where they work. It could be at their residence or at that golf club or their swimming club. So that for me is a real threat as well, that certainly at the top end of these companies, they need to be very mindful of. I would suggest to a lot of the senior executive leadership teams or leadership teams, is it necessary for you to be on these sites? And that's a conversation that we need to have. Now, it might be important that they are, but if they don't need to be, then why are you just giving somebody more information out there through open source to identify you and therefore potentially be more of a threat that you just don't need?
What we haven't mentioned is why would there be blackmail in the first place? And it could be that we normally think of blackmail as being for financial gain, but as John said there, it might not be. It might be we want you to stop drilling for oil in the North Sea. We want you to stop building this great big construction project down in London. We want you to whatever it is that they want you to do. You can't respond to it if you don't know about it. Issue is absolutely critical, that you have to understand it, understand that threat, understand the what's happened, what is the response, and how do you deal with that by getting the right people together.
Again, I think it doesn't take a genius to work out there's two sides to this. There's the reputational damage that can be inflicted on a company. Trying to build the new runways down in London has been massively emotive. And a lot of companies, building companies won't want to go near that. So you've got the reputational side, but I think there's also, for me, the slightly more sinister side is the litigation side. So that's where, if you are targeted, most companies now will sign non-disclosure agreements. That's the right and proper way to do business. But if you have an employee who's not happy or dissatisfied and breaches those NDAs, then that could be very, very embarrassing for a company. And ultimately, if you go to the company and say, look, we're going to release the fact that you've disclosed this, they probably will want to try and deal with that without going to the police. It's all very well us saying you should go to the police, and it is the right and proper thing to do. But I don't think anyone has the information available as to what has happened that hasn't been reported to the police and has been dealt with, rightly or wrongly, by the payoff or whatever it is those people or that person is asking for to make it go away.
Yeah. So, this has been brilliant. We could chat about all this all day, but I just think if someone's listening and thinking, I've realised that blackmail is probably a bigger threat to me and my company than I had previously thought, are there kind of 2 or 3 points that you could leave them with for further investigation, shall we say? David?
I would say yes, make sure that you do have emergency response, crisis management plans and policies in place, and that this is something that you are open to. You're open to discuss. It's not something that you're going to bury your head in the sand for. So if you are going to have a tabletop exercise, maybe this is a subject that you could discuss. Is this something that you do as a whole team? Is it something you do as a corporate entity, maybe an exec sort of leadership team, over a coffee on a on a Friday morning. Maybe we do put a scenario in and say, right, how would we respond? Who would we get together? What do we need to do? And get the individual teams thinking about it in advance. And we've talked about those lines to take in advance. Just review your lines to take. Just review your pre-prepared statements. And just to see, do we have one that would cover this? And can we get it out quickly enough if it breaks?
Great. John, would you add anything?
Yeah, echo all of those points that David made and just reiterate that if a company can have a genuine open disclosure policy to limit the embarrassment on that individual, ideally that has to be confidential as well. You don't have to say it's John Cooper that's made it fool of himself or had been silly. But if John Cooper is able to come to his, senior management or whoever the people are and actually be very honest and say, look, this is what's happened, that's a massive help. And again, I think we've already mentioned it, but holding statements ready to go really quickly and trying not to play that game where we're being defensive. I mean, even releasing something like we're not in a position to disclose too much because it's subject to a police investigation. At least you're coming out and acknowledging that there's been a problem, there's been a data leak or whatever that thing is, but it's been investigated and we're working with the authorities at every level. If you can try and turn that around and bring it back.
Great advice.
And I think the last thing that we just mentioned there is that ongoing training and awareness. We've said it earlier on, is that just keeping the risk awareness for all the staff about their activities online, trying to keep themselves safe. And if they can keep themselves safe, then hopefully they'll be able to keep the company safe and reduce the likelihood of it happening at a lower level.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for letting me host this special episode of the podcast, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks,
Thank
John.
you, Kim, and
Thanks.
I really hope I don't see you again very soon.
Yeah.